Welcome to this third session, Exploring the Bible and all that it contains. Again, this is not an opportunity to ask about what it means in terms of faith, so much as what it is as a piece of literature and what we think the original author's intention may have been in writing down the stories that they wrote in the way that they wrote them. We've looked at a kind of overview in the first session, and then in the last session last week we spent some time in the first 5 books of the Bible, from Genesis through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The birth of the nation of Israel, the birth of identity as a people, the story of the exile and slavery in Egypt, or just of enslavement in Egypt, and then the return through Moses and the wilderness to the very brink of the promised land, and the death of Moses. And today we're going to pick up what in the Christian scriptures constitutes 11 books, the historical texts, which come as a group from the end of Deuteronomy onwards. 11 books that tell the story of the way that Israel begins to establish itself in the early parts in what is now Israel, and a little bit further afield. The boundaries obviously were different then than they are now. It also tells the story of how the people normalized their life, how they organized themselves in their civic and civil kind of society, how they organized their religious society, how they settled essentially into patterns of identity that have within them also stories about how authority came to be shaped in the beginning through those whom God directly appointed, into a pattern of judges who sat as kind of overlords over the community, and then from the person of Saul onwards we begin their journey with kings, having established the need and the desire for kings, and God, in the way the story is told, relenting and offering them kings. It's a story about all the way through that has as a strong theme as well. One of the great themes is the theme of obedience, disobedience, and the consequences of that for individuals, for the nation. Part of the reason for these books being there and for them to be told in the way that they are is to give people who hear them a very clear sense of what it means to be a good Jewish person or a good Jewish leader, or just, I guess, to say, what does allegiance to God within this covenant, this idea of being a chosen people, what does that look like? How is that exercised? How is that broken, and what are the consequences? And there's also a very strong theme through all of these books of racial purity, of the need for the nation of Israel to keep itself racially pure. And so there are some very strong passages that deal with marriage to other women of other nations. There is a really, really strong, almost xenophobic, I think, to be fair, strand of narrative through all of these books about the importance of not somehow tainting the nation in any way by association, certainly in terms of marriage and so with people of other races. So that's where we're going, and it's going to be an absolutely supersonic half an hour traveling through Joshua, Judges, the book of Ruth, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, some of which you may never have heard of, but they are important, and they're in the scriptures for a reason, and they're in the order they're in for a reason as well. And so we're going to kick off beginning with Joshua and Judges, and spending some time with them. So a quick overview of the books that we're going to look at today. So we're going to begin with Joshua and Judges, which are about entry into the promised land, about war, subjugation, and slaughter. I think that's the kindest word to use in many ways to describe the way the story is told. The settling of the 12 tribes into their territories, so the kind of establishment of their sort of tribal boundaries. Disobedience and punishment, both for individuals within the law, but especially for the nation in respect of their obedience to God. The purity of the nation and the treachery of foreigners. And then Ruth, which isn't an odd kind of insertion into this. It's a particular story, a short story, an account of the conversion to Judaism by a Moabite woman. It's about the kindness of a Jewish man. It's about the establishment of David's lineage, in that Ruth's child is the grandfather of King David. And then 1 and 2 Samuel. We think about in Judges, in Joshua, we've had judges over the nation, and then in the books of Samuel, judges become kings, and the story of David takes center stage as the great king of Israel. In 1 and 2 Kings, we have the reign of Solomon, David's son, through to the brink of the Babylonian exile. A story really about Solomon's humanity and the way that he falls in and out of favor with God through his own actions as a human being. But it ends on the brink of Babylonian exile. 1 and 2 Chronicles, again, an interesting set of books. It's almost a condensed, retold history of Israel from Adam, right in the beginning, through to the release from Babylon that comes later in the nation's life. And then Ezra and Nehemiah, which are very much about the beginnings of return to Jerusalem from exile under Babylonian oppression, about the reconstruction of the temple, about the reconstruction of the city walls, about conflict overcome as a sign of God's blessing on the nation as it rebuilds, and more purity. So we'll begin with Joshua and Judges. As I said before, story of entry into the promised land, subjugation and slaughter, the settling of the 12 tribes into their territories, disobedience and punishment for individuals and from God, and the purity of the nation, as well as the treachery of foreigners. So when we left off at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we had Moses dying on the shores of the banks of the Jordan River, a little way away from that in the plains of Moab. And we had the story of Joshua coming into leadership almost as Moses' deputy through that time, and then leading the people into the promised land. Joshua tells that story. The book of Joshua tells the story. The Jordan River dries up. There are some great speeches. The people walk through on dry land. They come to the other side, and in the way that the story is told in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, because of the grumblings of the people in the desert, remember God had said to them, you will wander in the desert until a new generation has been born. That new generation has crossed over and entered what will become the promised land, and there's a wholesale circumcision of all the men. I don't know what kind of day that was, or how much fun there was had on that day. But there is a very particular story about an almost kind of ritual act of obedience to this distinct identity of circumcised people, and a whole generation is circumcised. We have the story of the Battle of Jericho, where the soldiers, the nation marches around the city walls, blow their trumpets, and the walls fall down, and only Rahab the prostitute, who had assisted some of the spies who went into the city to scope things out, only she is spared. Everyone else is slaughtered. There is at least one man and a couple of others who defy the rules, and they take some things in the process of the routing of Jericho. The instruction from God is that they're not to take anything, and they do. And there's a very violent punishment meted out upon them. Not just the men who took those things, but their wives, their children, their cattle, their possessions, everything is stoned and burnt, and they are expunged from the nation. Joshua is about the subjugation of tribes. It's about the subjugation of kings. Frankly, it's about genocide, and I want to read a little bit of Joshua chapter 10 to you, because this describes, and this isn't necessarily historically accurate. Okay, there's lots of archaeological evidence and evidence that suggests that this is not how the nation of Israel began their dominance in what is now Israel, what they call the Promised Land. But the story is told this way, and it's told this way for all kinds of reasons. Then Joshua passed on from Makkedah, and all Israel with him, to Libnah, and fought against Libnah. The Lord gave it also and its king into the hand of Israel, and he struck it with the edge of the sword, and every person in it. He left no one remaining in it, and he did to its king as he had done to the king of Jericho. Next Joshua passed on from Libnah, and all Israel with him, to Lachish, and laid siege to it, and assaulted it. The Lord gave Lachish into the hands of Israel, and he took it on the second day, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and every person in it, as he had done to Libnah. Then King Horam of Gezer came up to help Lachish, and Joshua struck him and his people, leaving him no survivors. From Lachish Joshua passed on with all Israel to Eglon, and they laid siege to it and assaulted it. And they took it that day, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and every person in it he utterly destroyed that day, as he had done to Lachish. And then from Eglon to Hebron, and then beyond that to Debir. And the narrative is the same, the language is the same. He struck it with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed every person in it. Now that's horrific, but it's part of the story, and it's part of the importance of the way the story is told. And again, the question isn't, is it historically accurate, or what does it say about God? But from a literary point of view, what purpose does telling the story that way hold? And what great theme is it wanting us to grab hold of and understand? And that is the great theme through all of the first part of the Old Testament, the theme of purity, racial purity, the purity of the people. And the fact that as they make a fresh start in what will become their territory, there is no room for those who are not like them, for the possibility of pollution in some way. And the idea of moral purity, racial purity, religious purity, ethnic purity, all of those are very, very strong themes through the Old Testament. And they're problematic themes in the way that we might just clumsily read them today, because they do give permission and give rise to some of the superiority attitudes and beliefs that are there because of race, because of religion, because of ideology, because of culture. In Judges we have the beginnings of a kind of organized authority. Okay, this is one of the oldest books in this collection of books. Most of these books are agreed by most scholars to date from about the 7th to the 5th century, and they've been authored and codified during that time. Many of them have been put together as a composite from other sources, and again, we don't have original sources to look at, so we have scholarship that lays hypotheses before us, and the evidence suggests that most of these historical writings arose between the 7th and 5th centuries, a tumultuous time in the nation of Israel's life, when they told these stories, collected these stories, wrote these stories, refined these stories, and then had them become scripture. So in Judges we read about further conquest, further subjugation, and a little bit of coexistence, which is a little more evident than it was in the book of Joshua. We also see a literary device come into the story of the nation of Israel through the book of Judges. God appoints a succession of people to be judges over Israel. And there's a very clear message of cause and effect in the book of Judges. Quite literally, the words repeat themselves in passages that follow on from each other. And then the nation did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Pretty much those exact words. And then there is some consequence. And the book of Judges is about having arrived into the promised land, having settled into the 12 tribes and their territories, beginning to establish themselves. There is a period of testing, of refining, of questions about allegiance, and again, the old chestnut of purity that raises its head in all those ways. And then there are stories like the story of Samson, which is a horrific story if you read it just at face value. But it is more than anything a story about the treachery of foreigners. Whatever you make of the historical accuracy of it, of Samson's extraordinary strength, of the nature of his character, because he's really not a nice person in 100 different ways. It is fundamentally a story that serves the purpose of describing the treachery of foreigners as part again of that purity and wariness motif and theme that runs through all of Israel's sense of self. So we come to the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, which is an account of the conversion to Judaism by a Moabite woman. It's about the kindness of a Jewish man and the establishment through their marriage and their son of the lineage of King David, who is a central figure in Jewish history. So Ruth is a short book. It's 4 chapters. Its authorship is unclear. It fits into a strange bit of Israelite history. It's more positive about foreigners than any other passage, but maybe it just puts foreigners aside, because one of the great themes, well, the great theme through the book of Ruth is of the way that this story and the kindness of Boaz and the conversion of this woman, the way that paves the way for the lineage of King David, towards King David, and then through David all the way within the Christian tradition to the person of Jesus. So it's a story about a return to Bethlehem for a woman called Naomi, who went to live in Moab as a Jewish woman, and whose sons married Moabite women. And Ruth is her daughter-in-law. Her husband has died, Naomi's husband has died, and they're not they're not in a position to inherit property. They are essentially destitute, and so they return to Bethlehem. And the story is really a story of how they survive, and of the importance of this man Boaz, who is a kinsman of theirs somehow, a relative in some way, who through Ruth's subservience or kindness or manipulation, depending on how you read the story, chooses to marry her, chooses to take her and Naomi in, shows kindness along the way to them before that even takes place. And then their son Obed becomes, as I said, the grandfather of King David. It's quite a contentious story because it can be read from many angles. One of those is to just look at it from a distance as almost a kind of Disney love story of, benevolent prince and peasant woman. But there are many other ways of reading the story. And we're in the moment in what's called Bible Month within our church's life, thinking about the book of Ruth. And not this Sunday, but the Sunday after, on the 28th, we'll be reading Ruth chapter 3. So just a heads up, if you want to have a listen to one of the more controversial and perhaps more challenging interpretations of the book of Ruth and that particular chapter and the story it tells, then my sort of recording for that Sunday, my sermon, will be reading that chapter and exploring that. The book of Ruth. So, on to 1 and 2 Samuel, which in the Christian scriptures, in the way we would look at the Bible, are 2 separate books, but in the Jewish canon of scripture, the book of Samuel is a single book, as is Kings, as is Chronicles, and as is actually Ezra and Nehemiah, the 2 books that we will look at towards the end. The authorship of the Samuels is attributed to traditionally to Samuel, and then Gad and Nathan, to other followers of Samuel and those who were serving with him. It's almost universally agreed now by scholars that the books of Samuel were cobbled together from a variety of sources, from about 630 BC until about 540 BC. So in a period of about 100 years, roughly in the 7th century, mid-7th century to mid-6th century, this book came to be in its historical form. And it is a narrative history of Israel. Samuel the prophet is central to the story in the beginning, having been anointed by God and given this task as a young boy. He anoints Saul when the people ask for a king. He anoints Saul as king. But Saul shows himself to be unworthy through all kinds of misdeeds and actions. And David, who at this stage has come to work for Saul, is one of his servants and one of his officials, who actually plays music to Saul to cheer him up. David is shown to be the true king. Saul becomes jealous, plots to kill David, and David flees and escapes to live with the Philistines. There's conflict and battle. Saul is killed. His son Jonathan, who is a close friend of David's, is killed. And in the unification that follows the nation of Israel, the unification of the nation of Israel, David is anointed king and comes to be ruler. But then, as is the theme in many parts of Scripture, especially those that tell of rulers and leaders, what follows is the story of, in a sense, the fall of David, the sin of David, the disobedience of David. He has an affair with a woman called Bathsheba. She's very beautiful. He sends her husband off to battle, puts him in the front line, which almost guarantees that he'll be killed, which he is. And God is not pleased. And David is confronted by the prophets. And his sons rebel against him. The kingdom is split. David flees again. There is a battle. His son Absalom is killed in one of those battles. And 1 and 2 Samuel come to a conclusion with the nations restored into unity and David returned to the throne, but now an old man and a frail man. So 1 and 2 Kings, which follow on immediately from the books of Samuel in the chronology of the history of the nation. In the beginning of 1 and 2 Kings, we find David on his deathbed. This again is believed to be a unified collection of writings that have come into the form that they are. And it's the story, it's history of ancient Israel from the death of David to the release of the people from Babylon. About to be released from Babylon. So as I compare my slides and my notes, I see that I've made a mistake in the slide. That Kings doesn't in fact take us to the brink of Babylonian exile. It takes us through the exile as well, to the brink of return from exile. What we have in Kings, what we have is what many scholars would say is a theological explanation for the destruction and devastation that come through the Babylonians. This is an explanation of how the nation fell short of all that God was desiring from them. And it also sets the foundation, builds the foundations for their return from exile. So we have from David through his death into the installation of his son Solomon, the very wise king. We have the story of the building of the first temple in Jerusalem. We have the story again of Solomon sort of losing his way and not, in the eyes of those who tell the story, being quite as harsh enough as he needed to be about the single God that the Israelite people and anyone who lived amongst them would worship. And that as part of that story, we again in the conflict have the split of Israel into 2 kingdoms, Israel and Judah. We have the Babylonian threat, which comes and is realized. We have the stories of the prophets of Elijah and Elisha, who speak truth to power in the midst of 1 and 2 Kings. 1 and 2 Kings are historical books. They are histories, but they're written, as I said, for a particular purpose. And many agree that the purpose is to try and understand, of course, after the fact, what it was in the nation's downturn, what it was that was the downfall of the nation in the eyes of God, that led to God essentially withdrawing protection from the people of Israel, so that when the Babylonians came to town, they were able to plunder, destroy the temple, and cart everybody off into slavery. So that's about 2 things. That's about the nation understanding its sinfulness. It's also about the nation finding a way to hold on to the hope of God, that God is still on their side, that God hasn't abandoned them, but that God is responding or withdrawing support, withdrawing response from them because of their disobedience. And so some would say that 1 and 2 Kings and books like it are not so much attempts to bash the people for being bad, but attempts to hold on to the blessing and the covenant and the promise of God because of their experience and their need to then revisit how they find themselves in exile and yet retain some necessary sense of Jewish identity as the chosen people, the chosen race of their particular God. 1 and 2 Chronicles. Again, as I said earlier, 2 books for us, 1 book for the Jewish community. A book that is considered to date most accurately from the late 4th century before Christ, and a kind of condensed history of Israel from Adam to the release from Babylon. It begins with a chronicle of genealogies. The first 9 chapters almost of 1 Chronicles are quite simply a genealogy, a story of the kind of line of descent of the nation through its chiefs and leaders and the people who make up its tribes. There's a little bit of Saul. There's a lot of King David in Chronicles. So the story is retold, and it seems clear to many that the authors of Chronicles had everything from Genesis through Kings almost at their disposal, because some of it is quite literal, almost verbatim copying of aspects of the story, but stitched together in a way that seemed to summarize how Israel got to be where it is. And in their retelling of it, Saul and the beginning of the dynasties of kings in the nation's life really falls away and is an afterthought. But again, David as the great early king and the great symbol of nationhood and unity and identity is held very dear. In 2 Chronicles, we have about 9 chapters of Solomon. So Solomon, again, as a leader, as a king, and his period of history is told in much more detail. There's a lot of Judah, very little of Israel, and by that I mean in the divided kingdoms. There's a lot of what happens in the nation of Judah, but very little in the land of Israel. And what we call Israel today is one territory, but only part of that was Israel in those days, and the rest was Judah. So we have a sort of revised retelling of Jewish history, and as I've said already, almost undoubtedly using the Old Testament texts that were available at that time, using the stories, the narratives, the oral tradition of Genesis through Kings, how we got to be a nation and find our way in the brink of the Promised Land, and how we then moved into the Promised Land, subjugated it, fell away from God, fell back into favor with God, established our structures of religious worship. We built the temple, we established our kings and our kind of holy authority in that way, and then found ourselves in exile. So Chronicles retells the story, but retells it from a particular angle with a set of particular purposes, and we can debate what those are and think about what they are. But at some point it's quite clear that in the late 4th century BC, the nation Israel felt that it was time, in some way there was a need to condense and rewrite the story a little bit. And again, that shouldn't surprise us, because we do that with our own stories, and we see that, as I said, in Genesis, in the creation stories with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. We see clear evidence of a story being repurposed to either affirm the old truths that were in it, or assert some new truths about what it means to be Israel, what it means to be ourselves, who God is, how God acts in our world, who are our enemies, who are our friends. That the story is retold, and it's retold and condensed into the books that make up 1 and 2 Chronicles. So we're into the last 2 books, nearly there. Ezra and Nehemiah. Again, for the Israelites, for Jewish people today, a single book, Ezra and Nehemiah. For us, 2 separate books that tell the story of the beginnings of return to Jerusalem, the story of reconstruction, of the temple, of the walls around the city, about conflict and conflict overcome by Ezra and Nehemiah and others who are figureheads in that. And there's a lot more about racial purity and about the need to maintain racial purity, and incredibly harsh action directed along those lines. So again, it's also probably late 4th century into the 3rd century, actually between 300 and 200 BC. These 2 books, the single book as it's written, come to be as it is. And it's, as I said, about return, purity, reconstruction. And there's a pattern through the book of Ezra, certainly. There's a pattern of a Persian king, because the Persians had conquered the Babylonians, and the Persian kings were moved by God in a succession of kings to show benevolence to the kingdom of Israel and to assert their right to go back, and even assist them in their going back to rebuild part of their life. You have this pattern of a Persian king being moved by God, appointing, commissioning a Jewish leader who then, through all kinds of travails, opposition and success, brings the nation a little bit closer to where it hopes to be. And the end of each of those sort of cycles ends with a great assembly of people and a lot of speech making. At the end of Ezra, there is in the last chapter almost a register of men who have taken foreign brides. Well, it is just that. It's a register of men who've taken foreign brides. And there is a very strong rejection of foreign brides and all children that have come from marriage to foreign women. And the book of Ezra ends with all of those men who have taken foreign brides and had half-caste children, in a sense, essentially packing those women and those children up and sending them away, repenting of the sin of having married those women and had those children, and just sending them away. It's a rather disturbing ending to the book of Ezra, and it's mirrored in the book of Nehemiah, and I'll finish by reading just a little bit of that. In the book of Nehemiah, we have again in that same cycle, Nehemiah appointed by one of the Persian kings to go back to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem, to rebuild the city walls. And he also begins to repopulate the city, asks for a clear percentage of those who are Jewish to return to the city to begin to re-establish the nation as the walls are rebuilt. And there's conflict and there's fighting, because obviously those who are encamped around the city and have taken up residence in many ways don't like the fact that it's all changing and the Jewish people are coming back to rebuild their city. But that same theme persists in the story of Nehemiah. Opposition, success, a great assembly, great speeches from Nehemiah to the men who are building the walls, to the nation as a whole in imploring them to return. And Nehemiah ends in very similar words to Ezra. And I want to read just the last sort of 10 or 12 verses of Nehemiah as a way of rounding off the histories. In those days also I saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon and Moab, and half of their children spoke the languages of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the languages of various people. And I contended with them and cursed them, and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not King Solomon of Israel sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. So shall we then listen to you, and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? And one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. I chased him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood, the covenant of the priests and the Levites. Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his own work. And I provided for the wood offering at appointed times, and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. So there it is. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. And we've essentially sprinted our way through a marathon set of histories that are capturing hundreds of years of the nation's life. And telling the story that they want to tell for the reasons they want to tell it in the way that they do. And revising the story they want to tell for the reasons they want to revise it in the way that they do at given times. So what do we make of the histories? Well, again, do we ask, are they historically accurate? Do they accurately portray in Joshua and Judges the violent military conquest and slaughter of all those who lived in what is now modern-day Palestine and Israel? No, because the archaeological evidence doesn't bear that out. Because the evidence of a kind of gradual infiltration into the nations and the emergence of the Israelites as the dominant culture and religion over time is a much more plausible understanding. What do we make of the Jordan River parting and the people passing through on dry land? Well, we make of it what we will. Those are the questions of faith and a God who is real and who acts. But those who study Scripture are not too bothered about whether the God that Israel represents is real or whether the history is accurate. Some do, and historical criticism is an essential part of the integrity of the text. But behind all of that, we're again dealing with motive. What is it that drives those who write these stories, who tell these stories and retell them and move them from an oral to a written tradition? What motivates them to tell the story in the way that they do? Well, again, as an overview, we find in the histories the same themes we found through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, except we find them not so much in the emergence of the nation of Israel, but we find them in the story of what it is that makes that a norm. What makes you Jewish? What makes you faithful to God? What makes you unfaithful? And what makes you pure? And where does the temple fit in to the nation's understanding of itself? And when we lived in the security of God's promise in the temple, and then all of that was dashed through the Babylonian exile, how do we hold on to God? How do we hold on to the idea of God still in covenant with us, even if our disobedience has caused that covenant to be withdrawn in its effectiveness? And then this very strong theme, which we have to take very seriously, especially in a time like the one we live in now, with the racial tensions that exist and the very helpfully and importantly highlighted fact of racial identity, of notions of purity and belonging and being at home. We have right the way through these stories the story of an incredibly violent and far-reaching and powerful drive to maintain purity. And you see that in Ezra and Nehemiah, in the harsh dealing of with foreign wives and half-caste children. You see that all the way through. You see that in the way that Solomon is considered to have fallen because he succumbed to the wiles of a foreign woman. You see that in the story of Samson, an horrific story of a horrible man, but a story that is not about him so much as the treachery of foreigners. And that's not me having an opinion about Scripture that says we should cast it out or not read those chapters, or that's the only correct interpretation of those events. But it is a theme that's there, and as people who tell our stories and as people who read the stories of others, part of what we're looking for in the Scriptures isn't the idea of, or the question of whether we believe it or not or agree with it or not, but what might the motivations be in those who wrote these books in the way that they did, and what might we learn about ourselves in the way we write our own stories and tell our own histories today through those. So it's been quite a journey, as I said, through just in a few short minutes, really, a massive section of incredibly rich, complex, detailed, controversial, disturbing and affirming storytelling. And however you may or may not dip into the actual details of what's there, what we have here is we have a nation, again, telling its story to itself in the Promised Land, out of the Promised Land, back in the Promised Land, asking, what does it mean to be ourselves? How do we organize ourselves? Where is God in that organizing? How do we understand authority? How do we give authority? How do we take authority back? What does integrity look like in our leaders? And how do we interpret the events of our day? And what do we do with the foreigners? It's always there. So I hope that's been helpful. It's just skimmed the surface. But if that's just given you an overview that you didn't have before, I hope you've enjoyed that and found it interesting. And I'll be back next week to talk a little bit about some of the poetry and some of the beautiful words and the disturbing words that are part of the songs and the poems that are a kind of literature in themselves in a number of books that follow on from the histories. Cheers.